Welcome to the fourth and final webinar of Western Governors Association's Working Lands, Working Communities Initiative, sponsored by our Idaho Governor, Brad Little. My name is Zachary Nowak, and I'm a policy advisor at WGA, handling our wildlife and conservation interests. We've had a wonderful run with this webinar series, and if you're interested, I encourage you to view our previous presentations on collaborative planning, conservation markets, and forest investments through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This final webinar, will be a conversation on the topic of invasive annual grasses management. With our panelists, we'll explore the strategies and tools available to land managers as they combat cheatgrass, ventenata, and medusahead, along with many other species that infest our working lands. Cheatgrass alone has already consumed more than 100 million acres of western rangeland, and beyond degradation of forage quality for livestock and habitat quality for wildlife, invasive annual grasses also exacerbate the frequency, size, and intensity of wildfires, placing not only our ecosystems at risk, but also our lives and livelihoods. The effective control of these invasive grasses requires collaboration, coordination, and innovation, and I expect our panelists will be able to showcase the success that happens when these things come together, and how we can achieve the same kind of success for others. So with us today, we have Stas Burgiel, the Executive Director of the National Invasive Species Council. Stas will be moderating our panel today. Additionally, we have Matt Baur, the Director of the Western Integrated Pest Management Center, Slade Franklin, Weed and Pest Coordinator for the Wyoming Department of Agriculture, and Jeremy Maestas, a wildlife biologist with USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. Among these panelists, we have a strong mix of experience and technical expertise, strategic policy, implementation, coordination, you name it, these folks have done it, and they've done it real well. So I'm very excited to hear what they have to say, and I hope our viewers are too. Before we start, I wanted to clarify that the first portion of this webinar will consist of a discussion by the panelists and will be followed by a Q&A session. Please submit your questions to the Q&A function at the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, or directly to askwga@westgov.org, and I'll drop that address in the chat. Now we'll turn it over to Stas to begin.
Great, thanks, Zach, and sort of good morning to everybody out there. And particularly thanks to WGA for organizing this panel. Obviously, the issue of invasive annual grasses is key and very important to many of us. And we're hoping that through this panel, we're going to recognize the ecological and economic challenges that invasive annual grasses pose for both invasive species managers as well as agricultural producers in the West. And as Zach mentioned, this is part of WGA's Working Lands, Working Communities initiative. And we're going to be looking at tools and strategy, really focusing on species like cheatgrass, medusahead, and ventenata. As Zach mentioned, my name is Stas Burgiel. I'm the Executive Director for the National Invasive Species Council. And that council includes representation across 12 federal departments and White House offices. So our role is sort of fairly high level. It's sort of DC sort of coordination and facilitation across agencies. And we work on a number of areas like, just for example, in this year, wildfire and invasive species, climate change, early detection, rapid response, information management, and the like. And that's from kind of a federal agency coordination perspective, but I'm really interested to hear more perspectives coming from the regional and sort of field level. NISC typically hasn't addressed specific invasive species in its management plans. Again, we're looking more at sort of the overarching connections, but clearly invasive grasses have an intersection and become prominent in a number of our activities. I already mentioned wildfire. Obviously, that's a big issue in the West, but also early detection, rapid response, and some of the elements with regards to our work on climate change. Also, it's clear that these invasive annual grasses are sort of joining that iconic invasive species status in the US, along with other invasives like invasive carp, zebra mussels, python, feral swine, and the like. I don't know if that's a good thing, but I think it does represent the threat that they pose and for the necessary need for a response. But when we look across all those iconic species, there are a number of kind of common questions that we need to think about, like what are the values that are at risk? Biodiversity, economics, ecological functions, human health. Who are the players that are involved, both of those, including those working on the landscape as well as those that are impacted by the particular invasive species? How to address them from a landscape scale, where to invest in prevention, early detection, rapid response, long-term management. How do we make those resource determination questions? What tools are in the toolbox and what is the capacity that we have to use them? So we're going to be addressing, some of those questions and hopefully others that come from the audience in the context of invasive annual grasses in the West. Fortunately, we have a great panel of esteemed experts, and they're each going to sort of give a overview, including an introduction of themselves, and then sort of the areas where they and their institutions are active in this field. So quickly, we'll start with Matt Baur with the Western Integrated Pest Management Center.
Great, thanks, Stas, and welcome everyone. So I'm going to just talk briefly about the Western IPM Center's involvement in some of these activities. Again, my name is Matt Baur. I'm the director at the Western Integrated Pest Management Center, and we are located in California, although we're responsible for integrated pest management, promotion, and adoption throughout the West. I don't think it would come as a great surprise to anyone that fire-tolerant invasive species are changing our wildfire regimes. And I've diagrammed that here very simply. Stas, I think, talked about this as well, where we've got these invasive grasses moving in, which are fire adapted. Fires, of course, are part of the landscape in the West, and so those fires are routine. But as those fires sweep through the landscapes at low levels, more consistent with what we've seen in the past, these invasive grasses then become more extensive. They expand their ranges. And with that expansion, we start to see much larger and much more frequent fires, which of course shifts the ecological balance away from the species that we're hoping for, the native species, to species that are to more of an invaded and degraded sort of habitat. So as I just mentioned, as these invaders start to move in, we start to see the degradation of habitat, which of course has important implications for some of our native or threatened or endangered species. And so as this environment starts to degrade, we start to see consequences in terms of environmental degradation. But this isn't the only consequence. Of course, human health impacts are also widespread. We saw this in recent years with smoke plumes that expanded not just across the West, but across the nation. And we know from the human health literature that smoke exposure of this sort has health consequences. And the economic impacts of some of these fires are enormous. We're talking in the billions of dollars, and not just structural loss, but loss of a loss of habitat in terms of grazing lands, rangelands, opportunity costs, human health costs, and also the inability to use some of those lands for recreation, which we know is so important here in the West. So integrated pest management, which is one of the things that our center is primarily responsible for promoting, works to try and limit the negative impacts of these pests and the pest management tools that are used to control them on environment, human health, and the economic sustainability of communities. Integrated pest management, what is that? This is an overly simplified sort of diagram of 4 buckets that we oftentimes put our different management tools into. If I actually was to list all of the different management tools in puzzle pieces, we'd have something more like the 1,000 puzzle piece image that we, I think all of us would steer away from those very complicated puzzles. But anyway, we usually put our tools into 4 buckets: prevention, avoidance, monitoring, and suppression. And the idea behind integrated pest management is that all of these tools should be considered when we're thinking about management strategies. And this is especially important in a place like the West. The West is a pretty complex area. We've got large urban centers. We've got extensive wildland and rangeland areas. We've got iconic national parks, national and state parks. And so it's not really very simple to design an overall management strategy for every place in the West. So around the urban centers, you've got urban centers, large urban centers in Arizona, Colorado, California, Oregon, and Washington. And those have extensive wildland urban interface areas. And so this is, a major concern. But in addition to that, you've also got political differences among the different states. So, if you compare the policies and the politics in California versus Idaho, those are very different animals. So a one-size-fits-all strategy isn't really going to work for us. Instead, we pulled, the Western IPM Center has really been trying to develop this idea, and this was also mentioned in the Western Weed Action Plan published in 2019, of forming work groups of local, state, federal, and non-governmental members to evaluate and develop processes for weed management. The Western IPM Center has an invasive species signature program, and that signature program is dedicated to funding work groups to pull together all of these different entities which have management responsibilities and interests in these different areas to start to develop management plans that would be acceptable to everyone. So I just wanted to highlight that the Western IPM Center does have, we do provide grants for these working groups. The request for applications for the working group grants opens in October, and we certainly would be interested in working with folks throughout the West in developing these work groups to address some of these critical issues. Stas, that's all I've got. I think I'll pass it on to the next speaker. Slade, I believe, is next, right?
Slade.
You bet. I'm going to put a couple slides up here too. So I hope everyone sees my slides okay, that I have up. Okay, thank you. My name's Slade Franklin. I'm the Weed and Pest Coordinator with Wyoming Department of Agriculture. Been here probably about 20 years working on invasive species issues and policy issues that relate back to work that's done on our state level with our weed and pest control districts. And obviously invasive annual grasses has been a big issue for Wyoming in the last 10 years, especially. A lot of you probably have heard we're dealing with medusahead and ventenata in the state of Wyoming. And we're really on the eastern edge of the movement of medusahead and ventenata. So we're really, in that process of EDRR versus just control with cheatgrass. But unique thing about Wyoming is we have some areas that are still not infested with invasive annual grasses. We have some areas that are in that process of being infested, and then we have areas that are already inundated with invasive annual grasses. So, we kind of are all over the board with where we're at. But I wanted to kind of put in perspective with the invasive annual grass discussion what landscape scale management really means. And I appreciate Matt bringing up the Western Weed Action Plan in action item number 3 about working together and working groups, and what they can do or how they function on a ground level. And so just to put it in perspective, I did put up a couple slides here. One of the issues that Wyoming's talking a lot about right now is migration corridors for our ungulates. Both antelope or pronghorn and elk and the movements they have in the winter and the summer, summer range into the winter range and back. And so here's a couple maps of some of those migration corridors. And, you can see just based on that state of Wyoming, one over there near Pinedale, Wyoming, the other in Saratoga, southern part. Then I also circled just up on the top part of our state where we are dealing the most with medusahead ventenata, although I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with that right now unless we have questions about it. See if it's going to let me go to the next slide. There we go. Then, we talk about migration corridors, doors, and of course, everyone's also talking with invasive annual grasses with sage grouse and sage grouse habitat. And a lot of times with sage grouse habitat, it's habitat for other species. And those are the two same circles I talked about with Pinedale and Saratoga. Well, there's a study that just came out of the University of Wyoming saying healthy sage grouse habitat is also very important for mule deer populations. And so you start looking at the wildlife habitat, critical habitat in the state of Wyoming and overlaying it, and you can see we can really prioritize where areas are for wildlife management and habitat protection in our state. And then you just look a little closer to this and why landscape scale matters and why coordinated efforts matter. This is a close-up look at Sublette County Weed and Pest Program for cheatgrass management. And the map on the left, I mean, there's a lot of layers there. You can see the green is Forest Service land, the brown being BLM land, the blue dots are state land, and then a lot of private land mixed in there. And then on top of that, the white area is your mule deer migration corridor, and the red outline is sage grouse habitat, core habitat. So it all falls together in one place. And then you have these invasive annual grasses move in, and they can take over an area. So Sublette County has organized all these agencies and local landowners to look at how we can manage cheatgrass on a landscape scale. We're not going to get ahead of the invasive annual grasses if we don't look at it on a larger scale for our management programs. So having that kind of coordination, that on the ground level coordination, more importantly, is the way that we can actually functionally get treatments done and do something to mitigate the impacts these invasive annual grasses have. Now, there are roadblocks to that. And you've probably heard Wyoming talk a lot about the importance of, for instance, BLM approving indaziflam for use on BLM use or lands for invasive annual grasses. And you take a look at the map on the left, where you can see the difference between Rejuva treatments and treatments on BLM where they couldn't use Rejuva because Rejuva hasn't been approved yet. And it really does mitigate their ability to do large scale treatments without having to fragment how those treatments occur. If you're using an aerial application, and I highlighted or zoomed in on a little area there, if you're taking an airplane that has to use indaziflam or is using indaziflam on the blue, but you have to land that airplane and reload it with a different chemistry or different chemicals or herbicides for that one little dot in the middle of all that blue, it really doesn't make sense and it's not economically sound. So the landscape scale treatments only work if we're coordinating on the local level, but we're also looking at what those policy impediments are and how we can mitigate those. And then just a little bit from the fire perspective, down in that Saratoga area I pointed out earlier, a couple of years ago, we had a pretty catastrophic fire called the Mullen Fire that really impacted a lot of that area. And you can see with that blue line on the map to the left, that fire bordered up again to the migration corridors. If I had the sage grouse map or core habitat map on top of that, it'd be right up against that too. The interesting thing about this is, again, a lot of working groups from the federal agencies working locally on the local level to get these cheatgrass projects done. But for this case, the Forest Service, Medicine Bow Route National Forest had already put in place the policy to allow for aerial applications of herbicides. That was key for after the fires. And what we're doing now is they're actually able to immediately after the fire, get an airplane up on that forested land and treat for annual grasses before they come back into that disturbed area. Now that's good for them, but we also have a lot of forests throughout Wyoming and the West that still don't have that ability to use aerial applications. So there is still fragmented policy out there with our federal agencies that would help with our landscape scale treatments. So, one of the things that we work on very diligently, both on the state and regional level, is policies that will help kind of mitigate those roadblocks. Again, Matt brought up the Western Weed Action Plan, which I think is a great playbook for what needs to occur for not just invasive annual weed management, but probably invasive weed management as a whole in the West. And it's really a good functional plan. However, it is a plan like all plans, it has to be updated continuously. And so our efforts are to make that a working document that is a living document with input from various states and agencies on what needs to be increased or improved on it, or maybe even removed. But then also just the efforts we have on the state level with our governor's invasive species initiative, and then also his statements or executive orders on migration corridors. Those kind of policies or executive orders do play an important role in helping us work with the various federal and state agencies in defining a singular goal when it comes to invasive annual grasses. So with that, I'll just end my slides and move on from there.
Great, thanks, Slade, for that overview. And let's go to Jeremy with USDA's NRCS.
All right, can you confirm you can see that okay?
We can.
Perfect. Well, good morning, everyone. Jeremy Maestas here with the NRCS. I work for our West National Technology Support Center out of Oregon, which is our hub for helping put science into practice within the agency. So I work across the Western US and have for about 20 years and specialize in Western rangelands and sagebrush ecosystems in particular. So I do a lot of work with our Working Lands for Wildlife team. You may be familiar with our sage-grouse initiative and some of our growing efforts out in the Great Plains grasslands. Our work today is really guided by this new framework for conservation action, we call it, in the sagebrush biome. It's kind of our next gen version of the sage-grouse initiative, where we went back and focused on the ecosystem itself and what some of the primary drivers of degradation and loss of that important habitat and ecosystem are. And we've really boiled it down to 4 things that we focus on with producers and partners in the West, things that we can leverage our technical expertise and our Farm Bill financial assistance resources to help landowners address. And that includes woodland expansion, exotic annual grass invasion, which we're going to peel back here in a minute, land use conversion, and riparian and wet meadow degradation. So this is really our guiding framework that we're leveraging lots of different funding sources to actually implement. So it's a strategic playbook, so to speak, on how we're going to tackle these threats. I want to back up and just give you a little bit of context for why we've come to recognize invasive annual grasses as such a big deal for private lands and ranch lands in the West. And this is some data from my colleague, Dr. Ken Spaeth, pulled from our National Resources Inventory, NRI data. And if we're looking across all non-federal rangelands in the West, essentially we can see that about 1/3 of all of our sampling points out there on the ground currently have some level of cheatgrass on them. So this kind of confirms what we know, which is that cheatgrass represents the single largest threat to the resilience of our sagebrush rangelands, and why it deserves its own class and its own attention. But we know that it's being followed by a whole bunch of other, perhaps even more insidious invasive annual grass species. And so if we can catch them early, we're going to try to do that as well. I want to unpack a little bit of the fire story. We're learning a ton with the breakthroughs in technology and remotely sensed vegetation mapping. In particular, our rangeland analysis platform data is giving us a new understanding of what's happening out here across our Western rangelands. This is some work that ARS funded alongside Dr. Joe Smith, the University of Montana, and a couple of new papers we have coming in the rangeland ecology and management. But I want to just show you what we're seeing, which is that when we you leverage that existing vegetation data along with drought and other climate data, we're essentially able to forecast probability of large rangeland fires now in the Great Basin, where the vast majority of those large mega fires are occurring. And what we've seen is that grassy fuels are really the driver of large rangeland fire risk in our region. And so that may be coming as a surprise to those who are used to forests, where, you know, their fuels aren't really limited. It's all about ignitions and fuel moisture. But on the range, it's about an accumulation of grass, and that takes a while. As you can see here, the dotted lines kind of represent years where in the Great Basin we had more than 1 million acres burn. What you see before that is a spike in the herbaceous production. And so the top line is total, blue is perennials, and the bottom is your annuals. And what we've seen is there's a lag effect where this grass builds up and we have these big fire years, right? And so through time, our perennial bunch grasses have always played a major role in driving large fire. But this is the concerning part. In annuals, and largely invasive annuals, have been increasing in their contribution to the overall biomass out there on the landscape, such that in about 2016, for the first time ever, we saw cheatgrass produce more biomass, above ground biomass, than our native perennials. And so this is changing the game, and partly why we're seeing more frequent large fire years. But the story gets even more nuanced, and we look at the data and we back up and say, you know, there's this narrative about the fire cheatgrass cycle, and we focus on that crisis, but there's a lot going on before that ever occurs. And so what we see is that, you know, the vast majority of invasive annual grass occurrence across the landscape is happening independent of fire. It's a plant ecology problem. Invasives are moving around, they're getting established, and they're out competing our native seedlings. And so we really need to think about it before fire in terms of how do we break this invasion cycle. And so I think there's a lot of you know, aha moments for me and our team as we think about, well, what could we do to help mitigate this invasion before it ever becomes more severe. So, you know, we honestly have not done a lot at NRCS over the years. We've dabbled some in places like Wyoming in particular. We've done some work on this front, but I would say we haven't really jumped in with both feet because we haven't felt comfortable that we have a strategy, a winning strategy, and the tools until now. I feel like we've come to a point where technology and some of the herbicide tools we have are actually allowing us to have a chance. And Slade highlighted landscapes like Sublette County where there is hope. There are examples of people winning at large scales. And so we're learning from that. And here's how we think about this problem. We've known for a long time that like invasive species management 101 here on the left suggests that we should be more proactive, do that early detection, rapid response, rather than be reactive and wait till the invasion is pretty far advanced, because the cost and the difficulty of restoration are really high. But on the right, we need to combine that with a landscape ecology perspective as well. When we look down across the landscape and we say, you know, what is the context of those places that we're managing? In other words, here's a hypothetical situation. Blue squares represent areas of no to low annuals. The red is annual grass infested areas. And the question we like to ask is, which of these landscapes do you think long-term invasive annual grass control is going to be more effective? Obviously, if you're in a largely intact, largely uninvaded area and you only have a few patches that you could really work to eradicate, you're likely to be more effective at keeping that at bay than running into the red landscapes and trying to save those postage stamps that are left. And so we need to change our mindset on what we're doing. And to do that, our Working Lands for Wildlife team put together this infographic that really describes our thought process for tackling a wide variety of threats, which is, you know, let's map out those places that are still relatively intact, target preventative management and proactive management to those places before they transition to a more degraded state. In other words, let's stop chasing the ambulance all the time and let's go in and do our preventative management where we still have an opportunity. Amazing examples emerging from states like Idaho, Oregon, Wyoming, that are all applying a statewide partnership approach to flip the script, so to speak, on how we tackle this problem. And so Idaho, ground zero for cheatgrass and fire. You know, they said, we've had enough. We need to get ahead of this. We still have places in Idaho that are intact, and those are represented as these kind of green core areas, so to speak. And in those landscapes, there's still opportunities to do preventative management. And so this motto of kind of defend the core has emerged in this process. And once we've kind of addressed that invasion early there, we do restoration and management to grow those cores and bolster them. And then finally recognize that if places are already too far gone with invasion at a large scale, we need to shift to a mitigation mindset and really reduce the impacts of that fire cycle on life and property, where it's definitely having massive impacts that we can't ignore. And I'll just wrap up by saying WGA has been an amazing partner in this. I've been in this arena of fire and invasives for 15 years, and we have come a long ways in terms of putting front and center cheatgrass and invasive annual grasses. And a lot of that credit goes to WGA for their toolkit for invasive annual grass management, published a couple of years ago, that gives that kind of Idaho cheatgrass challenge playbook to the rest of the West. And what we learned in that process is that like 70% of the rangelands in the sagebrush biome still have relatively low amounts of invasive annuals. So my point is, we still have a chance, folks, to do proactive management if we act today. And so hopefully our panel discussion, we can get into more of the details of what we need to do to make that happen. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over to you, Stas.
Great. Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks to all the speakers for kind of sort of priming the discussion, and certainly welcome those from the audience to put your questions into the question and answer featured at the bottom of the screen. But maybe to get the conversation started and thinking about this from a strategic perspective, there were a couple references to the Western Weed Action Plan. Then Matt, you were talking about kind of the coordination at a local level in terms of these working groups, which Slade, you also picked up on. And then Jeremy, you were talking about the perspective from a particular federal agency. And sort of with these sort of various intersecting levels, I'm curious in terms of how do you sort of keep the coordination so that you're all kind of hopefully moving forward in sort of a productive direction. And then I guess the other question is, are there gaps across the landscape that aren't covered, or how is the coverage on the landscape in terms of what's being done at the local level? So any comments from the panelists in terms of how to keep these various parts moving sort of in concert forward?
Want me to try that first? So it really, personal perspective, local leadership is important. You have to have people who are dedicated to invasive species management, who are, that's their primary purpose. If you have somebody local on the ground, they can make things happen. They are that hub for all the work that needs to be done. A lot of us on this higher level or state level, federal level, we should be in a supportive role. We shouldn't be dictating how the work should be done on the ground level. It has to be those local individuals who are running it. But, it's one of the bigger issues I see with weed management areas locally is sometimes you have volunteer people who have other responsibilities, and they have a very strong push to start with, and then it fades quickly. They get, some initial positives done, and then, responsibilities in other directions pull people apart. So it's for me, having in the state of Wyoming, having a weed pest districts where you have someone whose primary responsibility is that invasive species management on a local level, landscape level, across jurisdictional boundaries is important. And then on the same level with federal agencies, what we work with a lot, having someone who's identified as that key component or person for invasive species management. We still have a lot of agencies who put invasive species management as a secondary component to their work. And so, sometimes you have to pull them into the discussion. So it really is just focused individuals locally is what makes these projects work the best.
Yeah, I could add to that, Stas. I play that role. I work at the 30,000 foot level across the West, and I think our contribution is a shared vision. And so if we can help multiple partners work towards a common goal, I think that's a valuable contribution. And we do know where our boundaries are, right? We stop at like state level, local level, and let them figure out, well, what do we need to do and how do we do it? And then we listen on the other end and go, how can I work with all of our other partners to put the money where you say you need it? And so it's kind of like setting a bullseye and then, going, well, what ammunition do you need to hit that hard? And so, I think Slade's right on. Every time we've seen success, it's because there's a rock star sitting in a community somewhere who says, I'm gonna make a difference. And so capacity is a big deal, but those local people, they need our support. They need a vision. They need to know what we're hoping to accomplish together. And I think, at least on the wildlife side, you're going to see the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, Fish and Wildlife Service, NRCS. We're all kind of, this defend the core concept is really resonating. And I think it's something you're going to see us focused on as a shared kind of approach.
Yeah. You know, I think it should also be pointed out that we've constantly got this push-pull between fast action, you know, things that have to be done immediately, and these conversations that have to happen to make sure that everybody is on board with what's going to happen. And it's unfortunate that, you know, the cheatgrass problem has kind of gotten ahead of us a little bit. It would have been really useful if we had some of this work group structure, or these, you know, these structures in place ahead of time, so that we wouldn't be in a position of playing catch up, because those conversations get a lot harder when we've got to do something about this now. And so it, you know, and we've talked about this both, you know, well, everybody has talked about this on the panel, that, you know, it's way preferable if we're in prevention mode as opposed to reaction mode. There's time to have those discussions. There's time to set up those structures so that all of those relationships can be developed ahead of time. The trust is there. All of the pieces are in place. When the problem hits, it makes it much easier to deal with. If we're in reaction mode, you know, it becomes ad hoc. We basically throw committees together and try and get things done as quickly as possible. And that oftentimes doesn't lend itself well to, you know, everybody being on board.
I want to sort of follow up with, you know, this question of kind of the local rock stars and their capacity. Now, you know, there's been a lot of talk about the infrastructure law, and just last week the administration launched the American Beautiful Challenge, which, you know, is I think has 440 million coming from federal agencies, with the potential to leverage, or the goal to leverage up to $1 billion. So that's kind of like, okay, we've got, at least for the time being, a pot of money. What are you know, how does that get down to the people who need it? And so you're thinking, if you had sort of your magic wand and, you know, recognizing we have an opportunity here, what would your recommendations be in terms of how do we support, you know, these folks at the local level that have these needs?
Start, I guess. First and foremost, follow the Dingle Act, you know, where 75% of it should be going to on the ground work. Let's not capture all this funding going into overhead, for one, from the federal agencies. So, you know, that would be key one. And then, you know, from there, I do think there has to be a strong involvement. When it comes to invasive annual grasses, you can't run those programs on grants. Just, you know, grants alone. Grants are a one-shot kind of thing. You need consistent long-term funding to make an invasive annual grass program work. You know, so I guess I look at it from with the infrastructure funding, whether it's the DOI funding, the USDA funding. Think about how those agencies are going to support their local districts with their invasive species funding that they have in place already. Grants are great, but there needs to be an understanding of a couple things: is what the buy-in from funding is beyond the grant that they're requesting, and, you know, long-term, what that funding source is going to be. And secondly, just an understanding too, we are in a, I think we've heard it a couple times brought up, as a capacity issue right now. You know, we're having a problem with hiring people right now, and not just in the weed industry, but jobs all around. But we're also running into a capacity issue with, it's getting very difficult to get a lot of the herbicides, especially in, that are needed on these projects. So, you know, I hope the federal agencies, the departments are maybe realistic on timetables for what grants they do put out there. It can't be a one shot or 1 year and be done. You know, a longer term, and acknowledging that there's going to be some other barriers that we're dealing with right now that need to be addressed. That's a place to start, I guess.
Jeremy or Matt?
Oh, yeah, sure. This has been described as a once in a generation, or maybe once in a lifetime, shot in the arm for the West on this infrastructure bill money. And, you know, when you couple that with the Farm Bill and other resources at the state and local level, I actually kind of believe it. And so it's really important for us to get this right. And I've advocated fairly heavily in my circles that invasive annual grasses are the issue, which we could potentially affect at scales we've never seen before with this. But there's a lot that has to happen in terms of us understanding where to focus our work collectively, making sure that the agencies have the tools like Invasive to effectively deal with multiple year seed bank issues with annual grasses. And then, that capacity on the ground, like Slade's talking about, making sure that CWMAs and weed and pests, they're not worrying about every year where they're writing grants. They just know you have a job. And, I think there's a real opportunity right now to move the needle on this like we've never seen before. And so I think that's something that everybody here should be paying attention to. And one last thing, I see Mike Elmini's talking about this reluctance from the fire and fuels community to connect the dots between grass and shrubs. And this has been aha for me as I look at what I mentioned, which is grassy fuels drive rangeland fire. And so if you want to stop large scale, hundreds of thousands of acres fires in the Great Basin, we're going to have to address grass. That is not something the fire community typically focuses fuels management money on. And so we're going to have this dual conversation. Like, one, invasive grasses are a legitimate use of fuels resources. And two, woody plant management still is important because it's a firefighter safety issue. It's a fire severity issue. And so it's both things need to happen.
Yeah. So it's certainly true that the West is, I guess, the odd man out when you compare it to the other regions in the United States. And among other things that makes us different is the area owned and operated by the federal government in the West. I mean, they are the largest landholder in the West, and they manage all of that area. So at least here in California, we've seen that some of the biggest wildfires, some of the most destructive wildfires, have all been on Forest Service land. So infrastructure money going into Forest Service dealing with that problem is immensely important. I think that if that's done correctly, that it could impact not just the federal lands, but it could impact, of course, all private holdings as well. So it's critically important that those managers get that aspect correctly, get that worked out. When you talk about funding at the local or the state levels, oftentimes that really falls more to the state. And we've seen that, at least in some states, the issue of wildfire is becoming increasingly important, and that there are real money being thrown at that. But again, we're in this sort of reactive mode, and we see this all the time with a variety of pest issues, that once the problem kind of gets controlled, people start to forget about it, and they think, well, we don't have to worry about that anymore. We figured that out. I think we have to kind of get out of the mindset of, well, we're going to deal with this when it's a problem, and move more towards the idea that we should be thinking about what the next thing might be and what we need to have in place to manage it when it gets here.
Now, there's been sort of an active discussion in the chat, as well as some of the question and answer box as well. I'm kind of going to try to draw from both, but there's some questions around in terms of sort of restoration and sort of post application of herbicides, but basically sort of native seeds and the restoration part of things. And I guess, part of the question seemed to be the capacity or the cost to do that, as well as the availability of those seeds. So, from your perspectives, what are the successes or challenges that you've seen with regards to the restoration and, trying to put sort of the native seed back in the landscape?
You want me to start this time, Slade?
Yeah, I've done the first two. I was hoping someone else would jump this one.
Yeah, sure. Let me start with this. Because I get to sit in the cheap seats and I don't have to worry about a particular county or a watershed, I'm going to say, if I had a choice, I wouldn't be doing much restoration. If I had a choice, I'd go to lands that are still healthy, that 70% of the rangelands I told you that aren't broken yet. And that's where I'd start. just like we're all talking about, if you have a choice, start there. But there will be restoration at some scale even there, right? So there might be a few acres of 100 acres that are in need of restoration. That is a difficult task. That is something that a number of people are deeply working on the R&D, on the seed strategies, on the seed coatings and the innovations on that front. So I'm really hopeful that we're going to get better at that. And I think the ARS, Nature Conservancy, a bunch of partners are working on that front. But like I said, if I had a choice, I want to get out of the restoration business. I want to keep things good.
So I guess, oh yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead. I figured you'd go next.
Yeah, so I've been following the national seed strategy a little more lately than I have in the past, and I see, I guess, from the perspective of I think of the Mullen fire, especially in the 100 and some thousand acres that we burned, the availability of seed is a big issue, and a seed that is viable for the areas we need it in Wyoming, and that's going to be a key that we haven't really developed very well in the state of Wyoming yet. I know the state of Nevada is working on a state seed strategy right now, and I applaud them for doing that. And we're looking at doing something similar maybe in the state of Wyoming. But it's not just even for me. I'm not looking at it just from that reclamation perspective, but I'm also looking at it from the agricultural perspective and ag growers. And if I can help create a market for them that is consistent with them growing native seed that's needed within the state of Wyoming, then that's something we're at right now at the very starting point of looking into. So the value from the ecological end of things with a strong seed strategy, strong seed availability, but also the economics from an ag community in our state, so they can have a market they can consistently be part of, whether it's a high fire season or non-high fire season. So,
yeah. Yeah, so clearly the ecology is important. We can't just be thinking about, well, we're just going to dump a whole bunch of seed into the seed bank and call it good. That may work, and we have seen some instances where over time, and this is not months, this is more like decades, where restoration efforts can work. But one of the reasons I think in the literature that people believe that things take so long and why it's difficult to make that work is because it's not just the seed bank that has shifted here. It's the entirety of the ecosystem that has now shifted. Everything from the microbes in the soil to, pollinators that may be necessary in the field. The whole thing has shifted. And so it's not like you can just dump a bunch of seed in there and make it go back to the way it was. You have to be thinking about the ecology of the system when you decide that you want to go this route. And again, having everybody together talking about what needs to happen in a more, not just having a few people decide that this is the way things should go is critically important.
Yeah, and reclamation has to be determined on that local level too. What works in Idaho is not going to work in Wyoming, just probably 100 miles away in Wyoming. Reclamation is going to be different on the Red Desert compared to the forests. So it has to really be determined what those needs are on that specific site. There shouldn't be a playbook for each of those. It should be adapted as you need it.
One more. I'm just kind of watching the chat blow up with this restoration discussion, but one thing that's dawned on me is I think we've overlooked the role of the seed in this whole process. These are annual species that that's their sole purpose in life, is to produce as much seed as they can, because they only live 1 year. And we don't really talk about seed movement around the landscape. And I'm saying that at a broad scale, like maybe locally some places, but we're trying to just say, well, we should graze better, we should have better perennial grasses. I mean, that's a very important piece of the puzzle. But unless we talk about vectors and how the seeds get moved around, I don't think we're going to solve this in a meaningful way. And so I think that's a frontier for all of us to work through, because I don't know I have any answers, but we need to be thinking about it more.
Yeah, I think Jeremy's exactly right. And one of the things that we have to be especially aware of is the presence of off types or weed seeds in our grass mixes that we're deciding to use for restoration projects, because the last thing we want to be doing is spreading those seeds ourselves.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that was one thing in the infrastructure bill that didn't get funded, but I was a strong advocate for, was the eradication. I think it's called eradication of weeds on right-of-ways. But corridors for highways and interstates are still a major vector for weeds to get moved, and probably the primary vector. You throw on top railroads. I mean, they still are a fundamental way that weeds move across the West, and we need to address them better than we have.
I'm going to dogpile on this because and maybe it's a pet peeve of mine. I live here in Bend, Oregon. I drive to Burns, and the roadsides get mowed. It's sagebrush, for 2 hours, and the roadsides get mowed. And again, I think it goes back to this fire mentality, which is shrubs are going to be of higher flame length, more dangerous, all that. But what's in the understory? It's all cheatgrass coming back. And if you look at the landscape, that's where our hot spots for cheatgrass are for that long. And so we need our folks along those road corridors thinking along these same lines. That is a major way in which these are moving around the landscape. And I think with some of the tools like Indaziflam, I don't think it would be that hard to actually gain some control over that.
Agreed.
So looking at some of the pathways discussions, obviously you just mentioned sort of corridors and rights of ways. I guess another question coming up is if seeds are in hay, or one question with regards to cheatgrass seed and restoration mixes. Are there other sort of pathways like that need to be addressed, and are there sort of efforts to do that?
Well,
I'm not too familiar with that myself, so I'll kick to you guys.
Yeah, and weed-free forage is a program out there that is I think everyone's aware of. I don't necessarily think it attacks the issue of invasive annual grasses the way it should compared to a lot of the perennial weeds, but there's certainly it can help mitigate, I guess, to some degree, if people are taking care of their fields and that it's harvested and used in the backcountry especially. So but I think there's a lot of these systems of movement that we still don't completely understand. The wildlife component is one. We talked about migration corridors and what they're those migration corridors do to help move weeds along. I don't know if we'll ever truly get a full understanding of what those mechanisms are. We have the understanding of some of them, but not all of them. I think it's more important upon us is to have that EDRR mentality and pay attention. The thing with annual grasses, I always tell people when we talk EDRR, is it's a slow movement. You go out for 2 years and it may be slowly starting to creep in, but you're not seeing it. It isn't until it becomes a bigger problem that you're actually really comprehending there's a problem with my story or vegetation out there. So we just got to be more realistic and more, I guess, aware than we have been in some of these areas, and just know that they are, they're going to be altering over time.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that.
Yeah.
So maybe sort of turning back to sort of the tools in the toolbox. We sort of just talked a little bit about sort of prevention and weed-free forage. But when we look at, talked about sort of defend the core, grow the core, and sort of that early detection, rapid response phase versus the need for potentially long-term management of established populations. Are there different sets of tools for that? You've talked a little bit about sort of the use of herbicides. Certainly grazing has come up, as well as, is there a silver bullet in terms of biocontrol? But for tools in the toolbox in terms of kind of that defend the core, grow the core versus long-term management, and maybe this is, part of the integrated pest management approach. What do we have? What do we need?
So Jeremy and Slade, you want me to lead off? I've been
batting
cleanup.
I'm so excited for this one. Go for it.
So actually, it's something that we've just been talking about. There's plenty of literature that shows, there's some literature that shows that restoration is something that will work better in areas that are not highly degraded. And that's because of the ecology piece. So for instance, we've just started talking about how we can use restoration ecology If we're talking about a core area that we're protecting and we want to think about the seed bank, that might be a better place to think about restoration than going to a highly degraded site and hoping that the restoration will work there. So there's a clear example, I think, where sort of how you decide to manage the problem is going to be related to how degraded the site is.
Go ahead, Slade. I'll back cleanup.
Well, I guess, I guess tools in the toolbox. We talk about indaziflam. It's certainly the evolution, I guess, in herbicides in a lot of ways. It's an important step that we haven't had last 10 years, but it's not the silver bullet. And it's not going to work in every location. There could be some implications on annual forbs that, we need to be aware of. But grazing can be utilized in certain aspects to reduce your seed bank, reduce the fuel load. So we can't forget grazing can be used as a management tool in the right systems. But yeah, I think we're still in this position where we're looking for new opportunities and new tools in the toolbox. I would like to see some better biocontrol options out there. We have the biocontrols that I can't think of the soil D7, I think is D7ACK55, but we're not quite there with them yet. So I hope research is going to play an important role in the coming years in giving us better and additional tools to use for invasive annual grass, because I still think we are trying to figure out the best game plan in a lot of these situations.
Yeah, well, anyone who's known me for any amount of time knows I say the word context way too much, but I actually think it's that important that I have to repeat it and say it over and over and over, because to me, it's all about doing the right things in the right places at the right time. And we get really conflated when we talk about targeted grazing and fuel breaks and all this. And it's like, where are we doing it and where should we do it? And so if you look at some of those maps, I dropped a couple of the links, whether it's the cheatgrass map that shows you kind of where our quote cores or still uninvaded lands are, or our fire probability map that is a derivative of that. You can see that there's some places where it's more appropriate with a light touch. And there's other places that are more of that red square versus blue square diagram, and an aggressive mitigation mindset is needed. And so, if I'm on the Snake River Plain of Idaho, why are we arguing about fuel breaks and fire breaks? That place is changed, and people's lives are at risk, people's livelihoods are at risk. We're going to have to do something different there. But there's other parts of Idaho that are not yet at that level and probably need to be treated more carefully when it comes to things that are ground disturbing and potentially move seed around. And so I think it's all about the context. We see places like northern Nevada. Barry Perryman's done a lot of work on litter accumulation in some of these areas, again, where the context is annual grasslands. There's a lot of annual grass intermixed with your perennials. Well, that litter is facilitating cheatgrass establishment. And so they've been fairly effective at using dormant season grazing to reduce the presence and promote the perennials. And so, that works really well. So again, context.
So there's a couple questions in the chat with regards to the use of native seeds that can produce illegal chemicals and with the potential to, I guess, suppress cheatgrass. So curious if any of the panelists have sort of thoughts on the viability of that. And then an associated question is, when using sort of the herbicides, what comes up after, what replaces the cheatgrass?
Well, there was a regional integrated pest management project a couple of years back that looked at allelic chemicals as a way of defending against invasive grasses. Well, in that case, I don't think it was grasses that was the specific target, and there was a clear demonstration of an effect. So I don't think there's really any doubt that allelic chemicals are powerful tools. And plants utilize those tools extensively. But I'm not aware of anything super recent on the use of allelic chemicals to exclude, in the literature anyway, to exclude some of these invasive species we're talking about. And I guess it should be said that it probably depends, again, to hammer home Jeremy's point, and Jeremy, now you're going to get me saying it, is, it's context, right? In a highly degraded site, that may or may not work, but in a site that's not highly degraded, you might have a better chance at it.
Yeah, and I'm not much of an expert on that. Haven't been tracking it. I think my main message would be R&D. Absolutely, we have to continue to invest. There are no silver bullets. This is a lifetime effort we're engaged in here, and so yeah, I think support all those lines of investigation, and let's continually improve. But being the good NRCS soils guy, I will say, I think we're coming to an understanding of how alive our soils are, and how soil health plays a role in all landscapes. And so, I think there's a lot of complex things happening below ground with fungi and bacteria, and how those interactions set us up for either success or failure, depending on how far that invader changes the site. So we have a lot to learn.
So Jeremy, I wanted to sort of go back to something that was in your presentation when it was very interesting to see the graph where you've got sort of the spikes in annual grass biomass on the landscape, and recognizing that reality with what you were talking about, so really trying to push defend the core, grow the core. When you now kind of with that information and sort of hopefully sort of seeing when there are spikes, what is the response on the landscape, recognizing that there is a fire risk?
Yeah, perfect question. And I just wrote a paper that's hopefully going to get accepted soon on this, where we're taking those models and saying, well, what would we do in these places? What's some scenarios, right? So here's two examples. One is, in areas that we don't have a regularly high fire probability. In other words, maybe the perennials, only in really abundant years are the perennials getting to the point where we have big fires. We don't have many annuals. That's a place where it's very much aligned with this defend the core, EDRR, let's get rid of cheatgrass, and maybe we can have fire cycles that are somewhat normal again in those places. Then on the other end of the spectrum, just to contrast it, you have places that have more of a regular cheatgrass presence, where if you look at the perennials, really haven't changed over like the last 30 years. They go up and down, but not a trend. The annuals are pushing up and making above ground biomass more often, setting us up for big fire years. And so in those places, we should be closely watching. Like right now, we have a forecast out for this summer, and you can see where in your district, in your area, you're set up for a disaster if ignitions happen and we don't have resources available. And so it's really this fuels-based modeling. You can start to really target pre-positioning firefighter resources, for example. In that type of a place, you could actually put people there during lightning storms, and you can actually call up, the BLM's going to dial up more resources from their leadership to say, hey, my district is set to blow up if we don't get on this. And so it's kind of the proactive management in some parts of the district, and others you're more reactive because the status of how bad the cheatgrass already is.
And it should be pointed out too that many of the weed management areas that most of the states in the West have people that have been working in those areas for decades, and they have a lot of information about the changing nature of their area, and they track it, they see it, and we should really be tapping into a lot of that information that's available. I personally think a lot of that sort of just gets neglected. And there should be a mechanism in place for us to be able to pull that information out. And I think this has been mentioned. This was mentioned in the Weed Action Plan, but also in other places where we need to have repositories of data that we can access easily, so that we can pull that information from those local levels, from leveraging all of that experience and expertise that we've got in our states.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that's something we've talked a lot about in Wyoming with the University of Wyoming is how we do instead of top-down research, but bottom-up research and using the knowledge that we have already in place in a lot of these areas on what works and what doesn't.
And
Yeah,
then,
we're
go ahead.
just to maybe give a little sneak peek of something I've been talking with Dr. Brian Mueller, out there at University of Wyoming about is, he's done a lot on these learning networks and learning from the ground up about, sharing information on what we're seeing out there. And I think there's a group of us partners thinking about how to scale that up across the West. And so I think we're going to have to do that. This is like, if we ever needed adaptive management, it's on this problem because we do not have all the answers and we need to be able to adjust as we go.
Right.
And thinking about both the issue of fire risk and sort of that on the ground aspect, Matt, in your sort of opening remarks, you were talking about the wild and urban interface and the importance of that. And I'm curious, from your three perspectives, that's obviously a place where you've got a lot of human movement, the potential for introductions, the potential for spread.
Yeah, so I have 3 words to answer that question. Education, education, education.
Yeah, I fully agree. I don't think the urban interface really understands the dynamics of the invasive annual grasses in a fire, especially. And I just don't think the media has picked up on it either. Some of these large fires in Colorado, there's just no mention of, the vegetation structure out there and what how they drove those fires.
Okay, so maybe give each of the panelists a chance for a sort of final set of reflections or comments.
Well, so can I should have added one thing to the wildland urban interface question. It should be pointed out that, when you're talking about a major urban center where you've got millions of people, trying to educate that many people, really educating them so that they understand what's going on is a serious challenge. I mean, that's not trivial. Even some of the smaller areas where, extension efforts by the land grant universities are able to, penetrate and make some real inroads. When you start talking about any of the larger, million plus cities, really, we don't have a mechanism in place to get that information to all of those stakeholders. And it becomes a real resource issue for us. There just really aren't the resources in place for us to manage that. So I guess maybe there are some technology solutions that will help us, kind of like what we saw with sort of the pandemic and Zoom becoming an increasingly integral part of how we do business. And I know that Extension is looking hard at ways that they can use technologies to increase their reach. And certainly the pandemic showed us some things that work and then some things that didn't work. That's really a tough nut that we have to try and figure out how to crack.
And in the chat, Michael Maney has some interesting sort of comments with regards to the role of the insurance industry and with regards to fire risk and property.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah, I mean, we should definitely be looking at private partners as a way of, addressing this number of stakeholders we need to reach issue.
So maybe a round of final comments. I don't know, Slade or Jeremy.
Sure, I could start. Ignore invasive annual grasses at your own peril is what I would say. This is maybe outside of climate, the single greatest threat to the Western US. We've gone through various phases of denial and acceptance with cheatgrass to the point where in a lot of places there really isn't much action. Folks just accept that it's here and they're never going to do anything about it. I see signs of hope in Sublette County, Wyoming, and pockets around the West where people are actually pushing back saying, no, we don't have to accept that future here. That's what we need. We still have a lot of opportunity to do that across the West, but it's going to require a shift in our mindset from crisis management to prevention and early detection, rapid response. So let's go do that. And rally behind these shared visions, equip our local people with reliable funding they need to go do the job that they know needs to be done anyway. So yeah, I'm excited. I'm always a glass 3/4 full guy anyways, but like, I think we're at a point where technology, the tools, all of our thinking, the policy emphasis from WGA, it's now at a point where we can actually take this on, and I'm hopeful. So thanks for putting this on. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Well, I think I'll say the same thing Jeremy did. Opportunity. You know, we talk about the frustrations, the difficulties of managing invasive annual grasses, but there is opportunities to do something, and it does start on the local level. And we need to do what we can to support those programs that are trying their best to do that, whether it's policy or funding. And so, you know, that's maybe the primary step we need to keep in mind is if there are people out there who are working on this locally, what we can do to support them, because there is the opportunity to do something. And in a lot of these Western states, we still have a lot of land that we can protect.
Matt, you're muted, I think.
Yeah. The positive aspect here is that at some point, maybe we're not there yet, but at some point we will turn the corner on this thing, and we will start to make advances rather than just trying to defend those core areas. And it's hard to predict exactly how far away we are from that, but I don't think there's really any doubt that we can do it if we just really work together to solve this problem. But it has to be a joint effort. It can't just be one agency or one group leading the effort. It has to be everybody on board, all hands on board.
Great. Thanks, Matt. And thanks, Jeremy and Slade. I think it's been a great discussion. We've gone from thinking about overarching strategies and some of the tools in the toolbox to really sort of the folks who are doing the work at the local level and the critical need to make sure that, that they're sustainably resourced to be able to do that work and to do so. And I think in a more proactive rather than a reactive sense. So with that, I think we'll bring it to close, but I do want to give Zach with the Western Governors Association the floor for any sort of final messages.
Thanks, Stas, and thanks to all our panelists for what was an amazing panel. I'm really appreciative of y'all showing up and talking this out with everybody, and I really appreciate all our participants in the chat who offered questions and commentary and really drove this webinar along.